The New York Times isn't exactly known for being able to make friends on, frankly, the right or the left. In fact, their takes are getting so brain dead that sometimes I wonder, are those guys doing okay over there? In today's latest op-ed, they've actually argued, no kidding, that Ukraine should just give away its occupied territory and just let Russia win. Yeah, that's actually the take. No, seriously. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I'm going to explain the actual arguments against this preposterous op-ed that I want to point out is written by a Russian national who sits on the editorial board. So again, take this with a big old grain of salt with you. But let's talk about exactly why I think this dude's lost his mind. Okay. Now, I refuse to pay for the New York Times, right? Because they paywall literally everything and they're doing fine. So I'm just stealing this. Somebody conveniently on Reddit's Ukraine-Russia report posted the whole text of the article. So shout out to Empleado Este Albat. You're a true Chad. Okay, so basically the gist of the argument is that the war is a stalemate. It's expended a lot of lives and a lot of material on both sides. And that for Ukraine, they don't necessarily know if they're going to continue to get aid and if the war is going to get worse for them. And therefore, they should just tap out now. They should tell Russia that we can't retake our territory, liberate our territory. Russia, you can have all the territory that you've conquered. It's yours now. And we won't fight you for it. And this is sort of preposterous, right? Now, I understand where he comes from fundamentally, right? It's not clear that Kiev has a clear path to throw the Russians out militarily, or rather through liberating their country, right? The most likely function, the most likely outcome, as we've talked about, is a political victory with a complete Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. And that itself is a much more, I think, possible outcome, given the fact that, again, Ukraine as a country is all in on this war, whereas Russia continually has had one foot out the door, right? Russia has refused to conduct a general mobilization. And while they've improved their defense industrial base, they haven't gone over to a war economy, much unlike Ukraine, which is basically entirely a war economy. Now, I'm going to put a link in the description so you guys can read this entire hot take by this. You know, he won a Pulitzer, I think, but I've known some idiots who won a Pulitzer. I mean, they gave Obama the Nobel Peace Prize despite him having been president for like 2 months. It was really weird. Usually, you have to actually like achieve some peace to do that. And I say this as again somebody who was an Obama supporter, right? Point is, awards don't always carry the weight that you think they do. So here's the points I wanted to make sure we talk about in case somebody else comes to you in your life and says, you know, why doesn't Ukraine just, let Russia win? Okay. And why don't we in the West just tell Ukraine, hey, it's time to give Russia the 20% of your country. Just hand it over. It's not a big deal. Right? I mean, listen, does anybody really like Florida? Right? Wouldn't you sign over Florida? And you know what? We'd even throw in like Minnesota. I mean, it's basically Canada anyway. Listen, one of the problems, and the author himself points out that there's absolutely no way to know if Putin's offer is genuine. And this is the problem, right? So it's suspicious and tantalizing, which is an absolutely stupid word for it, right? He says, of course, an armistice is the word he's using for this peace deal, would leave Vladimir Putin in control about a fifth Ukrainian territory. He says he's not trustworthy, and he could prolong negotiations to bolster his forces for a renewed push, or lull Western lawmakers into cutting aid for Ukraine, and stalling and hoping that more favorable political leaders are elected, putting the Ukrainian country in a worse position. All of these things are actually things I agree with completely. The issue is that Putin is indeed not a trustworthy actor. You might recall that Russia already had several agreements with Ukraine, multiple Minsk Accords that have fallen apart. And then before that, Ukrainian sovereignty was actually guaranteed by the newly formed Russian Federation in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. And so it's clear that without clear coercion and enforcement, any deal with Russia basically isn't worth the paper it's printed on, right? The only deal that the U.S. ever was able to consistently get with the Soviet Union was literally mutually assured destruction, where the U.S. had to say, listen, we will destroy your entire country if you destroy ours. The only way you could negotiate with them was with an unbelievable number of nuclear weapons. And only in that environment could you possibly strike other deals with the Soviets. So that's sort of how Russia is as well. That if there were to ever be a deal, Ukraine would basically have to maintain an absolutely massive military deterrent. The other problem with not knowing if Putin's offer is genuine is that the only way we will find out that he tricked everyone is when his newly replenished army rolls toward Kiev. That's the problem with deception, is that the only person who knows for sure if Putin's lying or not is Putin. And so the fear is that if Ukraine signs let's freeze the lines where they are and call it a day, it's that Ukraine will demobilize, will reduce its military size, U.S. and what European aid will dry up, and then Putin will look around after 6 months, a year, and he'll say, guys, we got him. Because remember, Putin's military is only a partial mobilization. It's a backdoor draft. The Ukrainian military is staffed by everyone. Everyone is drafted. And so the issue will be that even if maybe Putin is honest today, 6 months from now, a year from now, he's going to look around and say, we have a chance. We now have the ability to achieve the things that I set out to do at the start of this war. So this sort of environment, right, is where you assume a ton of risk with no benefit. The only benefit that Ukraine really gets is that they would be less prepared for a Russian invasion. The problem also, though, occurs for the Western world more broadly, right? The world is not in isolation. And one of the things that countries do with each other is they are always looking around to see each other and what the other countries are doing. And Ukraine is not the only territorial hotspot. So when the world says, what does it mean to be an ally of the Europeans and the Americans? What does that get you, right? What kind of partner does it get? Because an alliance, in this case, is a little bit like a marriage. You marry somebody, you can't marry somebody else, right? You cannot be a country who is a staunch ally of the United States and a staunch ally of Russia. It just can't happen. They're incompatible. And so a lot of these countries are looking at Ukraine and they're saying, what does it mean to be the West's friend? Well, the answer appears to be that the West will help you out as long as it's convenient. And then when it's not convenient, the West will tell you, hey, give away 25% of your country. Give away 20% of your country. You don't need it, right? It'll tell you to surrender to your enemies. And so what does that mean if you are South Korea, if you're Taiwan, if you're Japan, if you're the Philippines, right? If you're a U.S. ally looking at a major military power like China, what do you think that those countries will think if the U.S.'s commitment to its ally Ukraine, someone it's publicly backed tremendously, and they say, well, actually, our friendship has limits. And that's sort of universally true in the world, right? That friendship comes with limits. But in this case, a friendly country standing up to a major foreign belligerent, a lot of these other countries are looking and saying, what does it mean to be a friend of the U.S.? And China is also looking at this and saying, what exactly kind of friend is the West. Because if they're doing their math, they're going to say, you know what, after 2 years, if you inflict enough casualties, if you burn enough military equipment, 24 months, you wait them out. They'll tell their allies, they will act as your agents. They will tell their allies, just give them what they want. Just give in. It's not worth it. So if you're Taiwan, you might be looking at this and saying, no, this is not the direction we want to go. If you're South Korea and North Korea might look and say, you know what? These guys, you know, they're not going to get backed by the West. The West won't show up for them. And North Korea might also be looking and saying, oh, well, we also have a way to defeat the West on the cheap. Remember, Russia has an economy the size of Belgium. And that economy the size of Belgium is at least able to destroy relatively high-tech Western weapons en masse. And that is a problem. If you let Russia succeed, you've proven definitively that this type of high attrition, drone-driven, conscript-driven warfare can achieve military objectives at a tremendous human cost. But remember, if you're an autocrat, if you're Venezuela looking at the Essequibo, you might say, human lives can be expended. We need to know that we can fight and win on the cheap. And in that instance, they may look to this war, and if they see Russia get a W, they're going to say, we can do it too. That can be us. The other, of course, person who's looking very closely at the outcome of this war is Putin himself. Remember, guys, Putin has the Ruski Mir experiment. This is an ideology that Putin wants to enter Russian history, or rather exit this world of the living, as a man who restored the Russian Empire. And to do that, he needs to take more than just a chunk of territory in eastern Ukraine. He needs to bring countries like Poland, like Finland into its orbit. And the reality is that if he can get Ukraine to acquiesce, then he may sit there and say, okay, other countries like Finland, if I can launch an incursion into Finland, if I can make it to Helsinki, right? Very doable. And then just hold on. The West cannot dislodge me. And that, for Putin, may actually look like a great strategy. For China and Taiwan, it's going to look like a great strategy. But what you don't want to do is embolden Putin to believe he has a blueprint to win, which is what you would do. Again, he's winning. He believes he's beaten the entire Western world, right? With a partial mobilization of prisoners and conscripts and and drunks. And that's pretty scary to think that he's got this secret sauce where if you take enough casualties, you can roll in and take out just about any NATO country. But ultimately, the real core argument that I make about this sort of why doesn't Ukraine give up is that what reason do they have? Like we talked about, if Ukraine makes peace with peace, again, in quotations, because it's going to be a temporary ceasefire, just like every Minsk Accord, just like the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the annexation of the Donbass, all of these annexations by Russia were followed by what amounted to ceasefires before Russian aggression ramped up. The real reason is that Ukraine doesn't actually have anything to lose. Because like we talked about, the reality that Ukraine is looking at is that even if Russia agrees to some sort of armistice or ceasefire, Ukrainian forces will have to remain tremendously huge. They'll have to remain very large in order to deter an invasion from Moscow or a reassumption of hostilities. And so that itself would mean that Ukraine is going to have to remain on a war footing for a long time. And at least while it's at war, they're getting a lot of aid still from Europe, from the US in much, much, much lower numbers. But if they declare this armistice, Ukraine will have to maintain a wartime-sized military with none of the help from its friends. And the help won't arrive until after the Russians roll over the border, if the help arrives at all. And so for Ukraine, especially now, right, they have pivoted to a much, much, much more efficient fighting style, relying extremely heavily on drones. In fact, I would argue that it seems like most Russian personnel and equipment appear to be taken out with automated systems like drones and mines and artillery. And so when you have that, especially if Ukraine gets better at this efficient defense, then Ukraine may sit there and go, we can actually sustain this war longer than Moscow can. We can be on the defensive war for 5 years. Can Moscow be on an offensive war for 5 years? Because remember, Ukraine, as long as it exists, is winning. Moscow needs to continually take territory. They need to continually hold this territory, right? If for example, if Ukraine stops fighting, right? I guess the Russians could roll over the whole country. But if Russia stops fighting, then Ukraine gets its territory back. You see what I mean? The point of all this, the takeaway, is that Ukraine, despite having a lot of battlefield challenges towards total victory, has very little incentive to stop fighting. There's no reason to. Russia is taking a tremendous level of punishment. Putin wants this peace deal to happen because the Russian public, can only sustain this level of casualties for so long, right? Especially on a war of choice, fighting for what is to Russia a sliver of territory that has basically been bombed to oblivion in the small southern part of their country, especially when the most geopolitically significant, Crimea, Russia held before this invasion. There was no reason for Russia right? Russia controlled the most important part. So for the Russian public, the more casualties they take, the more sick and disgusted they're going to get of this war. I think that's actually much closer to a potentially victorious strategy than any of us can appreciate. Anyway, guys, if you're going into the new year like me, you probably have a lot of resolutions. I have a lot of work resolutions, and I have a lot of fitness resolutions. And in order to achieve them, I'm going to be using Strike Gum. This is something I invented as an alternative to an energy drink. It's made here in the USA at a facility in Denver. It has 90 milligrams of caffeine in every single piece, as well as 100 milligrams of alpha GPC. And it is zero sugar, way better than the 41 grams you get in one of these energy drinks. So if you're interested, of course, we have a deal going on right now, free shipping in the US for orders over $70 and free shipping on orders over $100 internationally. So if you've been thinking about ordering or reordering, check it out, strikegum.com. And of course, a huge thank you to all the members of combatvetnews.com. I really could not do this without your support. Please hit like and subscribe on the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.